The First World War extended far beyond the mud and trenches of the Western Front, with campaigns fought across continents as empires clashed for global supremacy. The Somme and Passchendaele are deeply ingrained in British national memory, though severely misunderstood and mythologized, while Australians and New Zealanders will recall the Anzacs at Gallipoli. Largely thanks to the film, a sizable number of people will be aware of Lawrence of Arabia in the Middle Eastern deserts, battling the Ottomans alongside rebel Arab tribes. However, the fighting against Bolshevik Reds in the Siberian wastes, or German askari in the East African bush, a guerrilla campaign in which the British Empire was unable to defeat a much smaller force of German-led native troops, are virtually unknown. From the Battle of the Bees to the Boers who fought with their former enemies, the East Africa campaign is a fascinating but obscure theatre of World War I. At its forefront was a man who later steered clear of the Nazi Party, and Winston Churchill even considered as Germany's post-World War II leader, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, the Lion of Africa. In the late 19th century, the European imperial powers competed for colonies in Africa. By 1890, the borders were formally drawn. The Kaiserreich had 2 African colonies, in the southwest and the east. Dr. Karl Peters, head of the Society for German Colonization, gained land from native chiefs through making them sign treaties, often when they were drunk. He was a firm believer in social Darwinism, a pseudo-scientific theory which claimed survival of the fittest applied to human races, with white Europeans supposedly being superior to other less civilized races. Neighbouring German East Africa, present-day Tanzania, was British East Africa, present-day Kenya, a colony established for the specific purpose of halting German expansion in the region. The German Empire was one of the most brutal in its treatment of the native Africans it had control over. In 1904, the Herero uprising in German Southwest Africa was savagely crushed, and up to 100,000 Herero were killed in a genocide. German imperialism was initially focused on suppressing native insurrections within its colonies, rather than aggressively contending for land with rival European powers. The governor of German East Africa, Heinrich Schnee, was dedicated to preserving peace in his colony. At the outbreak of the First World War, German East Africa was in a vulnerable position, surrounded by enemies on land and potentially a Royal Navy blockade in the Indian Ocean. So Schnee declared the German ports of Tanga and Dar es Salaam open to emphasize his neutrality. However, 2 factors thwarted Schnee's strategy of maintaining peace in East Africa. Firstly, the SS Königsberg, a German light cruiser, undermined the colony's neutrality by capturing a British merchant vessel on the 6th of August 1914. This provoked the Royal Navy into action, and British shells were soon exploding on Dar es Salaam. Secondly, Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who assumed command of the Schutztruppe protection force in German East Africa, was determined to fight. He wanted to launch raids on Belgian, Portuguese and British colonial possessions, while the British were keen to conquer German East Africa and needed little persuasion to attack. Lettow-Vorbeck later wrote of his motive for the East Africa campaign. So long as we continue to resist, so long the enemy must pour resources into Africa and thus weaken his reinforcements in Europe. We were a knife in his side, and the more we turned it, the more he bled. He would antagonize the British into invading the colony, exactly the opposite of what Schnee intended. Lettow-Vorbeck planned to incur Britain's wrath by striking at British East Africa and the Uganda Railway. Born into a Prussian military family and a veteran of bushfighting in the Herero uprising, Lettow-Vorbeck was confident in his ability. Having studied the Boer War, he was knowledgeable of Boer guerrilla tactics and full of contempt for the British military leadership, whose blundering incompetency in that conflict was spectacular. Again, in the East Africa campaign, the British generals would prove inadequate. For example, Michael Mickey Tiger was a veteran of tropical warfare, but also a drunk, which impaired his ability. Unlike Lettow-Vorbeck, the British leaders were reluctant to employ their native troops, who were best suited to guerrilla warfare in that terrain and climate, due to racist prejudice. The advice of 2 Boers, Jan Christian Smuts and Jacob Jaap van Deventer, about swiftly manoeuvring and not underestimating native African soldiers fell on deaf ears, at least initially. It was only in the closing phase of the campaign that native African soldiers were properly used by the British in the fight against Lettow-Vorbeck's forces, with Van Deventer eventually becoming the British commander-in-chief. Lettow-Vorbeck had no more than 15,000 troops under his command at any time during the campaign. The majority of his Schutztruppe were Askari, native troops raised from the Wamanyema and Wasukuma tribes, though there were 9 all-European Schützenkompanien, sharpshooter companies. Lettow-Vorbeck's army of 2,000 Askari, officered by 200 Germans, was divided into units of about 200 men, called a Feldkompanie, field company. Each company, split into 3 platoons, boasted 2 Maxim machine guns and usually 2 37mm field guns. Though modern rifles and smokeless ammunition were initially in short supply, the Askari became progressively better armed thanks to blockade runners and captured British weapons. While British forces were ravaged by tropical diseases and suffered in the alien climate, the Askari and local colonists under Lettow-Vorbeck were generally better adapted to the environment. However, in the cold and wet, pneumonia took its toll on native African troops. The British had the King's African Rifles, KAR, which comprised of 3 battalions, numbering almost 2,500 native African soldiers and British officers. However, the bulk of British forces at the start of the campaign were Indians, from 2 expeditionary forces, totaling 12,000 men. Though the British had thought they would be better suited to the tropics than whites, the Indians were devastated by disease. Later, a South African army of 30,000 men arrived in East Africa, but also became diseased. Portuguese Askari and expeditionary forces, along with Askari from the Belgian Congo, fought against Lettow-Vorbeck as well. On the 15th of August, Lettow-Vorbeck struck his first blow, attacking the British post of Tveta with 7 companies. Capturing it cost them merely 1 fatality. Meanwhile, the British gained control of Lake Nyassa after a Royal Navy ship fired a single shell at the Hermann von Wissmann. Rather comedically, German Captain Berndt was indignant that he had been fired upon by British Captain Rhodes because the two were friends. However, the Germans sank a Belgian ship on the 22nd of August, putting Lake Tanganyika in their possession. Additionally, the Königsberg was wreaking havoc in the Indian Ocean, capturing a Royal Navy ship and sinking another. This compelled First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill to gather a squadron with the mission of destroying that formidable German ship. This meant a large number of British ships were occupied with trying to neutralize the Königsberg for months. As Lettow-Vorbeck would do on land with guerrilla warfare, at sea the Germans were distracting the British and making them use resources which were disproportionate for the task. The Germans faced a few setbacks as well. Although they captured the British fort at Majoreni, they were halted at Gazi, near Mombasa. KAR reinforcements drove back the attackers in a rare instance of the British using their native troops during the campaign's early phase. The German attack on Karonga by 800 men, under the command of Major Erich von Langen-Steinkeller, was also reversed. Though heavily outnumbered, the British garrison of only 70 men held onto their position until relief arrived. The British proceeded to ambush the retreating Germans, inflicting heavy casualties. With his provocation complete, Lettow-Vorbeck now prepared his forces to defend German East Africa from the upcoming British invasion. The target of this would either be Tanga or Dar es Salaam, and the Germans did not have the manpower to adequately guard both. However, Lettow-Vorbeck knew to expect a slow and clumsy British advance from his knowledge of the Boer War. This would be easy to counter with his fast-moving Askari, who could make themselves ready for the attack before it came. Indian Expeditionary Force B was tasked with conquering the whole of German East Africa. This was in spite of its leader, General Arthur Aitken, having no battle experience, and the 16th Pune Brigade being transferred to the Middle East. Aitken's view of native African troops as inferior, while being ignorant of his own troops' poor quality, was another major issue. With an inexperienced, overconfident and bigoted leader at the helm, the British offensive might have been doomed to failure from the very beginning. As time went on, a series of almost comedic blunders and misfortunes would only make matters worse for British forces. After many of the Indian soldiers had waited 2 weeks below deck, suffering from heat and illness, the transport ships left for East Africa. On the 30th of October, the ships arrived at Mombasa and then continued to their target, Tanga, without allowing the troops time to recover from their grueling experience. Before landing the expeditionary force, Captain Caulfield bizarrely insisted on giving the Germans prior notice, because of Tanga being an open port. This meant Lettow-Vorbeck was alerted to the target of the British attack and dispatched troops to Tanga by train, sending more reinforcements once he was sure the landing was not a feint. HMS Goliath had engine failure, so only HMS Fox made it to its destination. Unable to approach the harbour due to shallow water, soldiers were ferried from HMS Fox to a nearby beach, Beach A. They avoided the main harbour due to possible mines, but their landing was then hindered by a reef, forcing some troops to wade ashore. Following a piecemeal and tedious landing from the 2nd to the 3rd of November, Brigadier General Tighe, Aitken's subordinate, moved inland with his forces at 5:15 am. Immediately the advancing Indians came under fire from Askari of the 17th Feld Company, who were positioned behind a railway cutting. Although Tighe failed to outflank 17 FK, the Askari were about to withdraw due to being low on ammunition when German reinforcements arrived from New Moshi at 7:30 am. The 61st Pioneers, an inexperienced non-combat unit, broke and ran. They were soon to be joined by the 13th Rajputs after a German counterattack. While Aitken regrouped his force on Beach A, more units were landing at another nearby site, Beach B. Due to a complete lack of reconnaissance, Aitken did not realise the German forces had withdrawn from Tanga, in the belief that holding it against Tighe's army was impossible, so an opportunity to march into the town unopposed was missed. Early the next day, Lettow-Vorbeck arrived and ordered that Tanga be reoccupied, having discovered the British idly waiting on the landing beaches. He positioned his forces to face a predictable frontal assault, planning to launch a flanking counterattack on the right. While the German forces ate sausages and swigged coconut milk, their enemies made lengthy preparations for the upcoming advance. At 2 p.m, the British began struggling through the undergrowth in a traditional battle line. German machine gun fire caused some wavering and disturbed swarms of enraged African bees from their bullet-shredded hives, resulting in additional fear and confusion amongst the British ranks. Hence the Battle of Tanga's other name, the Battle of the Bees. There was fighting in the streets of Tanga until 6 FK was reinforced by Schützen Company in from the German reserves, led by Schutztruppe officer Tom Prince, and the British were expelled. Under immense pressure, the German line nearly cracked, but Lettow-Vorbeck and his officers assured their men by mocking the enemy's fire with laughter. The battle was decided when the Maxims of 13 FK tore into the British flank with devastating effect. According to Lettow-Vorbeck, the rattling machine gun fire mowed down whole companies to the last man. As daylight faded, the British made a general withdrawal. Only a misunderstood bugle call prevented Lettow-Vorbeck pursuing his enemy as German forces returned to their base. Once more, Tanga was briefly undefended, but Aitken did not take advantage of this. Besides, it would have been difficult to regroup his disordered, demoralised and depleted troops for another advance. Night was also falling, which would make coordination more challenging. The British left behind enough of their equipment for 3 Schutztruppe companies, all of which was captured by Lettow-Vorbeck, and 817 casualties, 359 dead, 310 wounded, and 148 missing. Only 145 Germans and native Africans, Askari and carriers, were killed in comparison. However, among these fatalities was Tom Prince, who was a good friend of Lettow-Vorbeck. Outnumbered about 9-1, Lettow-Vorbeck, the Lion of Africa, and his men had achieved their first great victory.